I want to introduce Rob Tuck. Rob is assistant professor of modern Japanese literature and culture at Arizona State University as of this year.
This summer, yeah.
Just starting in. Rob had previously been at the University of Montana, which, as many will know, has its own long history in Japanese studies. Rob got his PhD at Columbia in 2012, a place that's dear to my own heart. And at Columbia, he studied modern poetry, and especially the poetry of the Meiji period, which is wonderful and at the same time rare. Modern poetry generally is really neglected, so we think are going to owe a lot to Rob for bringing modern poetry back onto the agenda, but particularly the poetry of the Meiji period is difficult, unusual, sometimes seems disconnected from before or after. So it's something really especially important to devote attention to. And that work has just recently resulted in this great book, Idly Scribbling Rhymers, Poetry, Print, and Community in 19th Century Japan, which is recently out from Columbia. It's a book that is structured around the career of the poet and critic Masaoka Shiki, who, among other things, is responsible for turning the Edo period practice of haiku into what we now know as haiku. This book argues that, as we will hear more about today, that poetry really should be understood as having a central place in the creation of modern Japanese nationality, and in literature perhaps is more important than prose, which usually gets all of the attention, and I'm guilty of that myself, and a couple of reasons. One is that poetry circles in Japan have a lot of participants. I mean, even now, right? There are a lot of so-called amateur poets who are not really amateur in the sense of not being very good at it. They just have other ways to make their living. And this was also true in the Meiji period. Also in the Meiji period, poets and poetry critics had an important part in debates about, in a sense, the nationality of Japanese literature and, in that respect, the creation of ideas about a nation. And also, Rob would argue that poetry, through its sort of emotional quality, can have a much more significant impact on people's sense of belonging than serialized novels, for example. And he talks about all of this sort of under the rubric of poetic sociality, which is a really interesting idea that we will hear a lot from. Rob is actually embarked on another project already, which is the translation of Nihon Gaishi. It's an important work of 19th century sort of restorationist historiography by Dai Sanyo. But I think we're really honored to have him here today to talk about his recent book. So, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, kochira koso, I should say. All right, well, good afternoon, everyone. As introduced, I am Robert Tuck of Arizona State University. It is a great pleasure and an honor to be invited here to talk a little bit about my research. I'd like to thank, obviously, Chris Hill, but also Barbara Kinzer, Yuri Fukuzawa, everyone at the CJS for making this possible here today. Now, as Chris just mentioned, my talk here today is adapted in part from my recent book, Idly Scribbling Rhymers, Poetry, Print, and Community in 19th Century Japan. I think I'm contractually obligated to point out it is available from Columbia University Press for the very reasonable price of $65. Now, again, as Chris pointed out, the book is centered primarily on the work and life of Masaoka Shiki. He was a poet, haiku poet and literary critic who actually a contemporary, born at the same time as Natsume Soseki, but died at the relatively young age of 35. He's often credited as being essentially the founder, sometimes even the term father is used, of the genre that we think of as the modern haiku. And his writing and work is going to be my focus here today. In the book, I actually look at three different major genres of traditional Japanese poetry. Kanshi, which is poetry written essentially in literary Chinese. We call it Sinitic poetry. Waka, which is obviously, I think, one of the oldest, or if not the oldest, traditional verse form in Japanese. And Haikai, the pre-modern collection of practices including linked verse, hoku, senryu, point-scoring haikai, which later became known as haiku. Now, most studies of literature and the nation in the Meiji period have taken the position that literature serves as a focal point for increasingly cohesive ideas of community. In my book, I actually take kind of the opposite position. I argue that there are some significant fault lines in the idea of a national poetic community that we need to pay closer attention to. And these fault lines are of gender, social class, and political affiliation. And it's actually these last two themes of social class and political affiliation that we're going to explore in the talk today. My talk, I think, could perhaps be described as something of a revisionist history of haiku reform, of how haiku became understood as literature. We're going to be exploring the range of discourses and ideas that accompanied the transformation from pre-modern haikai into the modern haiku during a quite specific and limited period, the Meiji 20s, roughly the period 1890 to 1900 or so. And what we'll see is a range of ideas about how haikai can become bungaku. This is the Japanese word basically for literature. And when I say that this is a revisionist talk, I want to say that there are two specific assumptions about what haiku is and what haikai was that I think I want to mention right at the start, which I'm going to challenge here today. The first of these, very simply, is that both haikai and haiku take as their primary focus the seasons and the natural world, that they are primarily, if not exclusively, about these topics. This is something that has been, I think, taken as read. Sometimes it's been the basis for criticism of haiku. In 1946, in a very famous polemic against haiku as it was practiced in Japan at the time, the critic Kuwabara Takeo wrote that one cannot expect much from haiku when the process of writing it inspires a child to notice for the first time that there is a moon in the sky. In other words, his critique here is that the natural world is a fairly boring realm from which to draw one's material. Now, the flip side of this assumption that haiku's domain is almost exclusively the natural world is that the function of commentary on social, political, cultural matters, in essence, human affairs, is basically not done in haiku. Or if you do it, that it's done through haiku's, I suppose you would call it a subgenre of senryu, a sort of a comic and satirical counterpart to haiku, which is nevertheless formally distinct from it. So that's the first assumption that I want to challenge today, basically that haiku, as we understand it, is fundamentally apolitical. The second assumption is basically that both haikai and haiku are popular literature. And by that I mean that they are a literary genre that is by and for the common people, however we may define that. This certainly holds true for pre-modern haikai, which was written by untold tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of people in Japan during the Edo period. And a number of scholars have noted this and commented on this. Eiko Ikegami, for instance, in her 2005 study, Bonds of Civility, suggests that, among other things, haikai networks, precisely because of their social eclecticism, that anybody could join them, commoners, samurai, nobles, whoever, actually formed one part of the origins of modern Japanese civil society. And I think much the same assumption also holds true for the modern haiku. I mean, Chris noted accurately that to the present day it's practiced by, I think it's fair to say, millions of people in Japan, certainly around the rest of the world as well. One of Shiki's most famous disciples, Takahama Kyoshi, actually is known to have observed with a fair amount of pride that 1 in every 100 Japanese people writes haiku. In other words, that it's a very commonly practiced genre. And I should note, just from my own experience, I think haiku's reputation for simplicity and accessibility means that it's, in some cases, actually the only form of metered poetry that is taught in English language school curriculums as well, something that is in some ways somewhat sad for English language poetry, but it's nevertheless a fact here. So what I'm going to do today is to show that when we look at Meiji haiku, much of what we think we know about haiku is wrong, to put this simply. The process of making haiku into literature in Meiji Japan entailed a number of operations of erasure and exclusion, of drawing very clear boundaries between what was literature and what was not. And not only that, but also drawing boundaries between who should be writing literature and who should not be. And precisely because of this, when we look at the Meiji period, I think it's necessary to rethink how haiku may or may not have been understood as a potential national poetry, as a kokushi, right? It's the word in Japanese meaning national poetry. So allow me to start then with the question of haiku as a form of explicitly political commentary. As I noted earlier, it's generally understood that haiku basically doesn't do political commentary. If you do satire, comedy, sexual, scatological things, they are usually done via the medium of senryu. This is a verse form that follows haiku's 5-7-5 format, but which differs in a number of important formal respects. It does not use seasonal words that evoke the 4 seasons. It doesn't use cutting words such as kana, ya, keri, and so forth. I'm sorry, that actually should be the other way around. Senryu uses vernacular rather than classical language, and it's also usually anonymous. And I should point out that the extent to which haiku is even capable of performing the function of political commentary really up to the 21st century is still a very unsettled issue in Japan. In 2002, the prominent Japanese haiku journal entitled simply Haiku did a survey of 50 of Japan's most prominent haiku poets, asking them a very simple question: should poets compose topical and political haiku? And this, by way of context, obviously was a year after 9/11 in the US, and was also, I think, 7 years after the 1995 Hanshin earthquake and the Tokyo subway sarin gas attack. The results actually were interesting. Somewhat surprisingly, only 4 out of 50 said absolutely not. They should not be composing it. 23 said yes, they should. 2, almost half the sample, actually answered, right? Sono ta. Among those actually were some people who objected to the word should. The idea bekida in Japanese, basically saying that, well, there's no such thing as should in haiku. You can compose on whatever you want. But the 23 people who answered yes, you should, argued, among other things, that yes, although haiku is commonly understood as being focused on the natural world, in haiku, the human and the natural are not really fully divisible, and haiku cannot be fully severed from the human context in which it is produced. But one interesting thing here was that virtually all of the 23 who responded that one should compose topical haiku were unanimous on the point that political commentary for haiku carried a certain degree of danger. It was very easy when writing political haiku to produce bad haiku. Okay? That political sloganeering or mudslinging didn't add much to the genre, and in fact was actually likely to make it unliterary, to basically degrade its status as literature. But what was not mentioned in this 2002 debate was that haiku on political and topical matters were actually exceedingly common a little over 100 years earlier in the Meiji newspaper world. And they were so common that there was actually a specific name for them, jiji haiku, current affairs or topical haiku. And Shiki himself, again, who is regarded as basically the father of the modern haiku, actually wrote and published a substantial number of jiji haiku. Let me give you one example that feels eerily relevant. This is from June of 1894, when the Japanese parliament, the Diet, was actually dissolved by imperial order because it could not agree on a budget for the year. This feels eerily familiar at the moment. Natsukusaya giin monzen hito mo nashi. The summer grass, the Diet gate out in front, there's no one there. The idea being that the Diet building here, because it's been dissolved, is eerily empty. And if you're at all familiar with the haikai tradition, the first line here probably rings a bell or two, because it's exactly the same first line as a very famous hokku by the legendary poet Matsuo Basho, Natsukusaya tsuwamono domo ga yume no ato, the summer grass, all that's left of ancient warrior dreams. And Basho composed this, by way of context, on seeing the ruins of the residences of the powerful northern Fujiwara clan in northern Japan. So the resonance here is somewhat like Ozymandias, the idea that there is a ruin or a monument to an arrogant and overbearing civilization that ultimately meets its end. The implication, of course, here is that for all their airs and graces, the parliamentarians in the Diet are probably on the road to destruction as well. We'll look at just a few more examples of topical haiku in a moment, but at this point I want to make what I realize may be a somewhat extraordinary claim, which is that in terms of what was being read and consumed in the newspaper sphere, in the public sphere in 1890s Japan, it's possible that topical haiku may actually have been the dominant mode of the genre during the 1890s, not what we would think of as conventional nature-focused literary haiku. And I want to highlight this claim here because I think it is very much going against what we think of as being haiku's main purpose here. Just as a couple of pieces of evidence here, topical haiku were exceptionally widespread in virtually all Meiji newspapers. The Tokyo Mainichi Shinbun ran a haiku contest in October of 1895. It advised readers who might want to send in their verses, either topical verses or just plain verses are fine. Tada no ku, for those of you who can read Japanese, has almost the subtext that topical haiku are the default and that tada no ku are just kind of almost boring, plain verses here. The same newspaper kept on doing this. In 1895, for instance, in December of the same year, the same newspaper advised its readers on what to compose. It wrote that topical compositions need not necessarily be limited to political questions. Matters in society or societal matters are also interesting. They're saying, obviously, go ahead, compose on matters of politics here. And I also want to point out that the two most widely read newspapers in Japan post-1895, and that date is significant because it's the end of the Sino-Japanese War, which led to a big boost in newspaper circulation overall. The Yorozu Choho and the Osaka Asahi Shinbun, I mentioned these because these were the first two newspapers in Japan to break the 100,000 copies a day mark. These were by far the most widely read newspapers. They, throughout the 1890s, carried topical haiku, but they did not carry what we might think of as conventional literary haiku, and neither of them actually did so until the turn of the century, until after 1900 or so. So, as I mentioned, Masaoka Shiki wrote a substantial number of these politically focused haiku, and Part of the reason for this was that the newspaper at which he worked, at which he began his career, which was called Nippon, or very simply Japan, was extremely interested in politics and was particularly antagonistic towards the Meiji government, towards the government of the time. On top of that, the 1890s, which was the time when Shiki was just getting started at that newspaper, were also extremely turbulent politically. There was a newly established parliamentary system that was really still sort of working out the kinks in its operations. There were frequent, what we would think of now as government shutdowns. There was budgetary deadlock. The Diet, the Japanese parliament, was frequently dissolved by imperial order in order to reconvene and try to solve the matter that was put before it. Shiki had a lot of fun with this. On one occasion, when the Diet was dissolved, he wrote, "Kogarashi no 10 bakari wa yasumi keri," bitter winter winds for 10 days or so, giving it a rest. The idea being that where in English you might talk about politicians producing hot air, in this case he's likening them to producing cold winter winds here. And all of the haiku we're about to see here, as you can see, are set in the winter season. Around about the same time, the Speaker of the House, whose name was Hoshi Toru, and Hoshi, if you speak Japanese, you'll know, actually means, or can be understood as star, was facing a no-confidence motion. And again, Shiki wrote, "The Speaker of the House, a fallen star." Okay. "Saeru yoya oboshi hitotsu nagare yuku." A freezing night, a single large star comes falling to earth. The idea being that this guy called Star has suffered something of a fall here. Okay? Other verses from around about the same time go beyond simply domestic politics to also address international affairs. The unequal treaties that Japan had signed with the Western powers in the 1850s had, among other things, initially restricted the movements and place of residence of foreigners in Japan. By 1890 or so, as a practical matter, these restrictions were generally being ignored and Westerners were moving freely within Japan. Nationalistic newspapers such as Nippon were very vocal in arguing that these treaty restrictions should be strictly enforced so as to give Japan some leverage in negotiations with the West. Shiki's commentary on this, "Hatsuyuki ya kutsu monnai e iru bekarazu." First snowfall, boots shall not pass through the gate. Boots being obviously stereotypically Westerners' footwear as opposed to geta or more traditional Japanese footwear here. Now, if you know anything about the history of the Meiji government, you'll know they were not particularly fond of criticism. On a number of occasions, Nippon was actually subject to legal sanctions for publishing material that displeased the Meiji government. The precise mechanism was actually what's called a suspend publication order, hakko teishire, which basically meant that you could not publish for a set period of days as a punishment for saying something that displeased the government. Again, Shiki and his editorial team responded to this through haiku. "Yuku haru o mugon no hito no aware nari." The passing spring, the sadness of a man who has no voice. Similar sort of thing happened a little bit later, a couple of months after this. An extra edition of the newspaper was actually banned as well. "Hototogisu nakuna to mosu hito mo ari." There are some men who would even tell the cuckoo that it should not sing. As you may be aware, Shiki's pen name actually means the cuckoo. So I think reasonable to conclude that this was his work right here. Now, there's an obvious objection at this point, which is that these verses, we've heard a few chuckles coming from around the room, they're mildly humorous, can perhaps be viewed really as senryu, despite my classification of them as being haiku. And this is, in fact, an argument that a number of Japanese scholars have made, that yes, formally these may be haiku, but properly they should be classed as senryu. But I want to stress that the purpose of writing these for the men who wrote them, and they were almost exclusively men, was often as serious social and political commentary by men who believed they had to contribute to an ongoing public discussion. And I should add, were also fully aware of what the distinction between haiku and senryu was, and chose very deliberately to write in haiku. These were not necessarily intended always to be funny or scatological in the way that senryu often are. One example of verse that's very serious in purpose actually comes from 1897, a series of verses published in Nippon commenting on the ongoing ecological disaster that was the Ashio copper mine in northern Japan. Some of you may know about this, but basically toxic runoff from the copper mine caused decades of environmental devastation in the Ashio area, about 100 miles or so north of Tokyo. This became a real sort of cause célèbre of the day in the late 19th century in Japan. One of these verses here, Dokutsuka ni nogitsune shishite ari haru no tsuki. On a mound of toxins, a wild fox lies dead, the spring moon. The point, obviously, spring is supposed to be a time for growth, for renewal, for burgeoning wildlife. Instead, what we have here is poison and death. The wildlife has either died or has fled here. A second verse from the same sequence of 10. Haru no mizu doshu o obite uo sumazu. Spring waters take on the stink of copper, fish do not live therein. Now, there's actually a biting pun in the second line here with doshu, which literally means the smell of copper, which is obviously on its face a description of the pollution resulting from the mine at Ashio. But doshu, the smell of copper, can also mean greed or avarice. So ultimately what this is a critique both of what the writer perceives of as the greed of the mine owner, Furukawa Ichibe, but also, I think, implicitly a critique of the Meiji government's growth at all costs industrial policy. So this, I think, is definitely intended as serious political commentary here. And I want to reiterate that simply categorizing Jiji haiku as another form of senryu is, to my mind, extremely reductive. The people who were writing them, as I said, were fully aware of the difference between senryu and haiku and considered topical haiku to be an entirely legitimate use of the genre. Now, at this point, one question obviously arises. If topical haiku were so widespread and even perhaps mainstream, what exactly happened next? Why did this use of the genre not subsequently continue? There's kind of an instructive example here. In 1901, the Yomiuri Shimbun, which then as now was one of Japan's most widely read newspapers, put out a call to its readers to submit what it called Jiji Mondai haiku, right? Current affairs haiku. This was taken a few days ago on the Yomiuri Shimbun website. It still solicits verse on topical matters from its readers, only now it refers to them, if you can read this in Japanese you'll know, as Jiji Senryu. In other words, the idea of the correct verse form for public commentary on political matters has clearly shifted here in the intervening 118 years now, I suppose. Part of the answer as to why this political function for haiku didn't really continue that much is that Masaoka Shiki's own reform movement, known as the Nippon Group for the newspaper around which they gathered, deliberately excluded it from their vision of what haiku was. They argued, as we'll see in just a second, that if haiku was going to be literature, it was necessary for the political to be completely removed. In 1897, in the inaugural issue of the haiku journal Hototogisu, meaning the cuckoo, which was extremely influential and is actually still publishing today, one of Shiki's disciples, Naito Meisetsu, explicitly addressed this. I think it's on the second page of the inaugural issue. This is clearly intended to be something that attention is drawn towards. If this, and by this he means the use of haiku for political commentary, if this is as far as haiku is going to go, then how is it different from senryu? No, actually, senryu would be rather better than haiku for this purpose. And Meisetsu actually went on to argue in this particular piece much the same thing that the critics from 2002 had done. He argued that if you are commenting on political matters, the risk is there that you will lapse into vulgarity, right? And vulgarity is a bad thing. Rather than run that risk, it's safer, essentially, he argues, to focus simply on the four seasons and the natural world. Shiki himself weighed into this debate just a couple of months after Meisetsu himself, also in 1897. In this case, he was actually reviewing a collection of kanshi, of Sinitic poetry, by his fellow poet at the newspaper Nippon, a person called Kokubu Seigai, who was very famous in the Meiji literary world for writing kanshi almost on a daily basis, attacking the Meiji government, attacking what he saw as corruption and malfeasance here. That same year, Seigai actually published a collection of all of his verse, so pages and pages of kanshi attacking the Meiji government. Shiki's review was, on the whole, positive, but he closed it by arguing this: the materials that Seigai's poetry addresses are almost all vulgar, coarse, unclean, and ugly. This is extremely unliterary. Again, if you can read Japanese, you'll notice hibungakuteki, right? This is not literature, right? Therefore, for the most part, Forest of Criticism, which was the name of Seigai's poetry collection, is not literature, bungaku ni arazu. And we should not judge it by the standards of literature. Again, bungaku o motte hyoron subeki ni arazu here. In other words, Shiki was performing something of a pivot here, having actually established himself to some degree by writing politically focused verse. He was now doing a 180. He was actually arguing that the vision of haiku that he was now laying out found that topical and political commentary was simply incompatible with what he understood as literature. This term, hibungakuteki, is a major one in his rhetoric that I'm going to return to again and again. And Shiki himself had very clear and perhaps somewhat arbitrary ideas of what was literature and what was not. And he used this as, frankly, kind of an argumentative cudgel. One famous example of this comes from 1895. This is almost always quoted in discussions of Shiki's work in English. The hokku is literature, linked verse is not literature. Okay? So something is literature, something is not literature. Bungaku nari, bungaku ni arazu. This is often claimed to be basically the death knell for linked verse in modern Japan. And we see this rhetorical strategy again and again and again in Shiki's writings. He uses this somewhat Procrustean definition in all kinds of different contexts. So if one of his definitions of bungaku was that it could not contain any political content, another use of his literature, not literature division, actually comes in debates over the idea that haikai was what's called commoner literature, heimin bungaku, essentially the literature of the common people. And this was an idea that started to be debated from the early 1890s onwards, and not coincidentally, this is the period around about which the idea of kokubungaku, of Japan's national literature, is also beginning to emerge as an academic discourse in Japan here. Now, as far as I can tell, the first time that the term heimin bungaku was applied to haiku actually was August of 1890 in the Yomiuri Shinbun newspaper. A poet by the name of Maeda Ringai argued essentially that haikai should be Japan's national poetry. It should be its kokushi. The reasons that he gave for this were really twofold. Firstly, as he wrote, that haikai is a commoner poetry, a universal poetry, a Japanese poetry, a uniquely Oriental poetry. And he went on to add, everyone among the people of our land, even at the lowest levels of society, possesses a certain amount of artistic spirit. In other words, everyone in Japan should be writing haiku. It should become our national poetry here. And it doesn't matter what level of society you may be at, you are still capable of composing it here. In other words, the boundaries of haiku's national poetic community, if we can use that term, and the national community as a whole are pretty much exactly the same here. Now, this idea of haikai as being commoner literature was actually debated on and off over the next couple of years. Some commentators claimed that it was a good thing. Others claimed that it was a bad thing. But there was no real disagreement with the basic idea that haikai was indeed commoner literature until Shiki made his intervention towards the end of 1892. And this perhaps is somewhat surprising given that Shiki has this reputation as the founder of the modern haiku, which, so we think we know, is a very broad-based and popular literary genre. But Shiki was actually extremely critical of the idea that haikai could or should be commoner literature. He wrote, and I'll read this very quickly here. For the twin reasons that it is easy to compose and uses vernacular language, haikai of late has acquired the nickname of commoner literature. This is a new entry in the Meiji dictionary, to be sure, but nobody seems able to say for certain whether this is meant as praise or mockery. In fact, many people's judgment is that it can only be meant as a slur. In other words, commoner literature is actually a really bad thing. He goes on. True literature, shin no bungaku, is sublime and elegant, this koshou yubi in Japanese, and does not necessarily gain the approval of large numbers of people. And this is because, if anything, in many respects, commoner and literature are almost completely incompatible here. So true literature, in Shiki's view, cannot be popular and broad-based. He says explicitly, almost in so many words, commoner literature is a contradiction in terms. We're back again here to literature, not literature again, right? There's very clear division between the two here. Now, I should point out that Masaoka Shiki in 2000s parlance was something of a troll. He often made very provocative statements in the print media, which he didn't necessarily adhere to later on in his career. However, Shiki, this point that haikai could not be commoner literature was something that Shiki was actually very consistent on throughout the whole of his career. A couple of years later, responding to a different critic's argument that haikai was kokumin bungaku, in other words, the literature of the people of the nation, he wrote much the same thing. I'm sorry, I missed this, but commoner literature is not part of literature. It is bungaku igai. It is outside of literature. This was another term that he used quite frequently. But with regards to kokumin bungaku, he says much the same thing. Literature large numbers of citizens can appreciate, for the most part, will be literature of the very lowest rank, entirely unworthy of the term. If by literature of the nation's people they mean something extra literary, again, bungaku igai here, then that's fine, but if not, then I simply can't understand what they mean by the term. I wonder if it means the same thing as commoner literature here. So once again, we're back to this idea that a literature everybody can be involved in is not literature. Basically, it's a contradiction in terms, but almost by definition, for haiku to become literature, it has to become an elite genre here. Now, this does, of course, raise the question, well, who precisely then should be writing haiku if so-called commoners had to be excluded in the process of it becoming literature? Well, the simplest answer is that literature, bungaku, in Shiki's view, should be written by men of letters, bungaku sha. Right? And this is a term that crops up repeatedly in Shiki's writings and a number of others active in haiku reform around about the same time. Shiki doesn't really offer a clear definition for who he thinks a bungakusha actually should be, but from the way that he uses the term, and certainly from the demographics of the haiku reform movement, it seems pretty clear that this idea of a bungakusha had a great deal to do with social class and particularly with educational background. It heavily favored those who had attended one of the elite higher schools around Japan, and particularly those who had graduated from Tokyo Imperial University. Shiki himself actually was a dropout of that institution, but that never seems to have stopped him. Now, the idea that the bungakusha, those who had the proper academic credentials to define what literature was was actually pretty widespread among the major haiku reform groups active in Tokyo at this time. Now, Shiki's Nippon group is almost always the center of narratives of haiku history, but there were at least two other groups that were engaged in the project of trying to make haiku into a modern literary genre. One of these was known as the Teikoku Bungaku group. This was a group that was affiliated with the really academic journal Teikoku Bungaku, Imperial Literature, which was published by and run almost exclusively by graduates of Tokyo Imperial University. So almost by definition, they had the appropriate academic credentials here. But there's another group active at the same time who I think have largely been written out of narratives of haiku history, and that is the Shu Seikai, the Autumn Winds Society. This was actually regarded in Tokyo during the mid-1890s as the premier haiku reform group, not Shiki's Nippon group. Part of the reason for that was that one of its leading lights was the very famous prose fiction author Ozaki Koyo. He actually was a haiku poet as well, and many of the members of his prose writers group, the Ken Yusha, the Friends of the Inkstone, were also members of the Shu Seikai. The other major member was perhaps less well-known figure in literary studies, a lawyer, a criminal lawyer called Kakuta Chikure, who was, I think, a very well-connected political figure in Tokyo. He was also, I think, a Tokyo City assemblyman, but he also composed haiku basically in his spare time here. Now, the Shu Seikai, the Autumn Wind Society, was somewhat more eclectic than Shiki's group, but they too still emphasized social class and educational background in the vision of haiku that they were promoting. In 1897, for instance, one of the group's members, Mori Muko, notes that some people have criticized Masaoka Shiki for introducing the language of academic literary criticism to analyze haikai, even though, as he says, haikai is something that even the illiterate workman class can grasp. He goes on, reformers must develop a sophisticated critical vocabulary, and by this he means things like time, space, etc., for haiku, so that what he calls educated society, kyoiku aru shakai, can understand it. And he emphasizes this is really important in order for us to have the middle and upper classes learn about the way of haiku. This is chuto ijo no shakai here. So in other words, at least Mori Muko, as part of the Shu Seikai, understood the mission of haiku reform to be about introducing haiku to what we might term the better elements of society, the middle class and upwards. And I really do want to emphasize that this rhetoric of class distinctions was a mainstay of all of the haiku reform groups. Masaoka Shiki, again, writing in 1896, is quite clear on this. Even if new style haiku should gain more widespread popularity, those ill-educated barbers, fishmongers, grocers, store clerks, and young apprentices will never come within its bounds. We have some pretty clear rhetoric here. Some people today say that haiku is plebeian, it's heimin teki, but the new faction will never allow itself to become plebeian in the same way as the old school. And I want to highlight the word old school here, in Japanese the kyuha, because this was a group of haikai masters who in many cases had actually been active from before the Meiji Restoration. And it's useful here because the kyuha, the old school, provides a concrete reality to the commoners, right? This is, I think, who Shiki meant in many cases by the commoners of commoner literature. And if you read almost any English language account of haiku history, you'll see that the old school, the kyuha masters, are basically the bad guys. Donald Keene's work, for instance, pretty much says that they were terrible. Janine Beischmann's biography of Shiki, I think, rather uncritically reproduces this idea here. The standard view of the kyuha, the old school here, is that as poets they were mercenary, incompetent, unserious. They produced largely worthless, abstruse verse that was little more than riddles. In other words, the old school would never have been capable of producing anything that could be termed a modern literary genre. And it's worth saying that in modern Japanese language scholarship as well, this is widely accepted. There's, to my knowledge, only a handful of Japanese language studies that actually take the so-called old school masters remotely seriously. So the modern history of haiku, I think, in many ways is a victor's history. It is written from the point of view of Shiki and the reform group. But just by way of bringing our talk today towards a conclusion, I think there's room in, or there's value in not taking this assumption or this idea of the Kyuha as being useless entirely at face value, to actually have a look at what they thought about everything that was going on during the 1890s. And when we do this, this really, I think, completes the picture that I have been trying to paint here of haiku reform as inextricably connected to questions of social class, because they fully understood this idea of a new movement in haiku as being connected with those exact issues. Now, I should point out that even after Shiki's rise to prominence, old school masters and their disciples remained numerically far greater. There were far more of them than Shiki and his groups. And they were actually still very active. The old school masters remained very active even after Shiki had really begun to lay into them. Their rhetoric as to what haiku was really in sharp contrast to that of Shiki. I think a year after Shiki had written his broadside here against shop clerks and fishmongers, two old school masters, Ashinan Setsujin and Kikakudo Eiki, advertised a collection of their works with the rhetoric that haikai was a genre that was held in common by society as a whole, and a genre in which, as they put it, the voices of town and country, high and low, forever chant together. In other words, it doesn't matter who you are. You can write haiku. It's a genre that creates essentially unity here. A month or two after that, the literary journal Bunge Kurabu had another haiku competition where readers could send in their verses. This was supervised by an old school master who wrote very simply, haikai is the commoner literature of our country. So the old school were actually using the term heimin bungaku in a largely positive sense. They thought this basically was a good thing here. Other writings from around about the same time by old school masters really just reinforce this overall point here. One of the most prominent old school masters throughout really the whole of the Meiji period was Mimori Mikio, and writing in 1898 in the journal Bunge Kurabu that we just saw, he actually launched an attack on what he called scholars, the gakusha, who he saw were confusing people who were new to haikai. They were basically disrupting everything. He wrote, "In today's scholarly world, there is a tendency to use one's own theories in order to tear down the past." And I want to highlight the gakusha shakai here. He has a very clear idea as to who exactly is meant by this. There are many, he writes, who for all their studies are not well versed in the great way of haikai. In other words, these highfalutin academics with all their fancy theories, they don't actually know anything about haikai. In this same piece, Mimori Mikio actually goes on to single out a member of the Teikoku Bungaku group called Sasa Seisetsu, and writes somewhat acidly of Sasa Seisetsu's criticism. "We must lament that one who holds a degree in literature should be so fixated on points of grammar and have no understanding of the deeper meaning of haiku here." In other words, I mean, Sasa Seisetsu had basically taken issue with Mimori Mikio's use of classical Japanese grammar. Mimori Mikio basically fired back by saying that the grammar was not important, it was about the overall meaning here. So I think the battle lines seem relatively clear here. The reform movements, at least from the point of view of the old school, are a bunch of overeducated elitists who, for all of their fancy theories and their academic credentials, really don't actually know anything much about haikai. And this is a point that's actually reinforced by another piece from 1900 by an Osaka-based master called Ote Kinsho, the piece in question was called Pointless Discussions on Haikai, Haikai Mizukakeron. Mizukakeron in Japanese means a discussion that's a complete waste of time. And what he does is he frames this as a conversation on a veranda, Japanese-style veranda, in the summer between two people, the old-school master self-proclaimed elegance and the reformer who is identified as commoner with a lit degree, the Heimin Bungakushi. As you might expect, this doesn't go particularly well. This rapidly degenerates into an exchange of insults here, and I'll just quickly summarize this. This is the master self-proclaimed elegance who is talking here first. Look, listen here. When it comes down to it, your so-called new school is just a handful of beginners, and it's a bit much for them to go around attacking Haikai at large. The commoner with a lit degree replies, "That's enough out of you. That's not at all true." What's not true about it? You go and become Haikai critics on the spot, even though the fact of the matter is you've composed barely 50 verses in your life and start talking about commoner literature, and Haikai is Sinitic poetry in 17 syllables and all sorts of serious stuff like that. And you can see a measure of contempt coming through here, even though it's fairly humorous, that basically you have young, overeducated men who are basically assuming that their academic credentials give them the ability to understand Haikai, even though they have little or no practical experience in it. Now, I should note that in most respects, the old school comprehensively lost the argument as to what haiku was going to be in the Meiji period. But in terms of their valorization, their positive assessment of haiku as heimin bungaku, they actually prevailed. After Shiki's death in 1902, and particularly after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 5, we actually start to see something of a 180 in critical discourse on heimin bungaku. Writing in 1905, the literary historian Iwaki Juntaro actually argues that haikai, precisely because it was heimin bungaku, had actually been responsible for Japan's victory in the Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, in part because he argued that it had created a coherent sense of national identity, right? It was a genre that everybody could compose. He even went so far as to argue that haikai had been responsible for spreading that awful word bushido, right? The way of the warrior among the Japanese populace, and that this had been responsible for Japan's victory. And then perhaps a rather more striking example, in 1912, with the accession of the Taisho emperor to the throne, none other than Kakuta Chikure, the lawyer we saw as a major part of the Shuseikai, who had seen his mission as promoting haiku to the middle and upper classes, actually presented the Taisho emperor with a book on haiku, by which he claimed, and these were his words, His Majesty may learn about the subtle charms of commoner literature. In other words, he decided now it was actually a positive thing. And I think this was a sort of view that strongly influenced the prevailing idea of haiku as broad-based and popular that we have to this day. So to wrap it up then, I think I've shown that the process of making haiku into literature during Meiji was a fair bit more complicated than perhaps has previously been realized, and that in the background there were multiple discourses of exclusion of both competing people and also competing visions of haiku and haikai as a genre. The exclusion of the political, despite very widespread popularity of haiku as topical commentary, and also the exclusion of what Shiki repeatedly referred to as the ill-educated, the refashioning of haiku as a largely elite genre. And I think if I want to make one sort of final take-home point, it would be that Meiji haiku, in addition to providing us with a fascinating and often richly entertaining body of largely understudied texts, also offers us an opportunity to see that what we may commonly think of as trans-temporal elements of haiku, not as being natural to the genre, something inherent to haikai and to haiku, but as something that was certainly contested and in many cases was also quite deliberately created. Thank you.
So we have time for some questions, and I think Rob is going to field his own questions. So please go ahead. I might actually, if I just start off with one. You had talked about these two processes of the exclusion of politics and the antagonism toward the idea of heimin bungaku, and I'm just curious that by this time in the 1890s, heimin was word that was more and more associated with socialism,
right,
as in the heimin shimbun.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if those two processes would in some way come together, not just as antagonism toward heimin bungaku, but toward.
Yeah, it's also associated with the freedom and popular rights movement, right? I mean, the Heimin Shugi. One of the, I didn't cite this here today, but the some of the critics who are actually writing on haiku as Heimin Bungaku are approaching it specifically from a freedom and popular rights movement, from the idea of Heimin Shugi. What's interesting is that their perspective is that yes, haiku was, or haikai was, Heimin Bungaku, but that this was actually a bad thing, that haikai was fundamentally a docile form of literature. It was what brainwashed commoners during the Edo period consoled themselves with. It lacked any kind of energy for freedom and for popular rights here. With regards to the connections to socialism, I'm not aware of that connection being made explicitly. I don't think Shiki wrote about it in those terms. Soseki, though, I actually did. He was one of those people who, I think after Shiki's death, kind of took up the idea of haikai as being heimin bungaku in a relatively positive sense. I would not want to be quoted on this, but I think in his writings, he actually says that his heimin shugi is quite thoroughgoing, and in some respects, he is actually quite sympathetic to socialism. I mean, I've got a translation of one of Karatani Kojin's pieces on Soseki and Shiki coming out very soon, I hope, which actually makes this exact point, that Soseki's, what he calls commonerism, was actually really quite thoroughgoing. In terms of socialism, I mean, Nippon as a newspaper was, it's difficult to characterize its political views. It's often referred to as nationalistic, but it was not necessarily nationalistic in the sense of being chauvinistic. I mean, Kuga Katsunan, the editor of Nippon, is on record as having expressed a lot of interest in byodo shugi, right, in egalitarianism. He didn't necessarily adopt what we might think of as classic Meiji nationalism. I think he had a much more sort of broad-based idea of popular popularism, I think you might refer to it. So yeah, I don't think, I'm not aware of there ever being an explicit connection being drawn with socialism as such, but certainly the broader resonances of the term heimin bungaku are very definitely at play in this overall discussion, yes. Okay, yes?
This is one of those short answer questions, I'm afraid. Thank you for this lecture because it's answered a lot of questions that have formed in my mind over the years about Japanese poetry. But I'm going back to the survey that you mentioned earlier and the answers. And I was struck by the fact that there were 4 people who said, no, you can't go beyond the nature. And I was wondering, is there a geographical analysis of that? Were those people the people that were farthest away from the epicenter of the event, or this is from a cultural historian point of view?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would have to go back and check.
Okay,
I don't know whether this was marked geographically or not. I mean, I will say just very briefly on geography. It's worth noting that Shiki and his group very clearly understood themselves as geographic outsiders. They were from Matsuyama, down in Shikoku for the most part, and they saw themselves as kind of moving in on the territory of the Tokyoites. So there was certainly, I think, a geographic distinction there. I'm afraid I would have to go back and check. I don't remember offhand from the survey in question, but it's certainly possible. Yeah.
promoted this idea of chasse,
Mhm.
or sketching from real life, both, I guess, visually and linguistically.
Right.
And, you know, this is the period that Karatani talks about the discovery of landscape, and I think he's got an anecdote about Shiki sending, maybe I got this mixed up, but sending some of his disciples to the station and saying, sit down and draw what you see.
Yeah.
And, or sketch what you see, and they say, well, there's nothing to sketch, right? Which, I mean, is a very potent kind of anecdote. But anyway, my question is, you know, these two pictures, the picture you've given of Shiki as sort of becoming this avid proponent of haiku as high art, and the sketching from life, or life sketching. What kind of links do you see between those two?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That is a discovery of landscape, which of course is a ethnic national landscape. What's going on there?
Okay. Yeah. No, that's an excellent question. I mean, the potential connections to chasse here are ones that I didn't explore because it wasn't the main focus of my book, but I certainly came across a lot of stuff that I think can constitute an answer to your question. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, this was the anecdote was that Shiki basically said, look, go and see what you find. Just write about what you see, write about what is in front of you. You know, put on your sedge hat and go out for a walk in the country, right? Now, in terms of chasse itself, I mean, as being very strongly focused on objective description, and usually, though not always, objective description of nature, it seems almost as if this is kind of an anecdote to a potentially undesirable degree of politicization in haiku at the time. It I think, resonates quite well with Naito Meisetsu's idea that it's simply too dangerous to be looking at things that may be vulgar. The natural world carries no such dangers here. I should note, Shiki himself wrote the topical haiku that we've looked at mostly under protest. I don't think he really liked doing it particularly, but he was told by his boss at Nippon that he had to do it. This was something that was done in the newspapers of the time. But it was actually, the connection here is through Nippon that Shiki first, I think, was introduced to the idea of chasse because one of his closest colleagues was Nakamura Fusetsu, this Western-style painter who pretty much came up with the or at least inspired in Shiki the idea. And there is a direct point of connection here because Nakamura Fusetsu was actually working hand in glove with Shiki at precisely the point that Shiki was writing those poems on censorship that I showed earlier. And Fusetsu actually produced several pictures that were political commentary in and of themselves. That the word hakko for circulation is a homonym in Japanese for radiance. And Nakamura Fusetsu actually, as a form of his own kind of personal commentary on this, drew a picture of an ugly woman trying to blow out a shielded gas lamp with the caption, "Extinguishing Radiance." And so that was his own sort of commentary. But Shiki himself actually told his editor, look, stop having him do this. He's an artist. We don't want him doing political stuff. And it was very shortly after that most of Fusetsu's subsequent drawings were landscape, nothing else. Right? And I think that was certainly one point of contact, one of the things that may have given Shiki the idea here. So yeah, it's all in the mix, if you see what I mean. I mean, my sense of chasse is that in part it was conceived of as a way of directing the focus very strongly onto the natural world. I think it would be a little bit overstating the case to say that it was simply a reaction to the popularity of political haiku, but I would argue that was certainly one of the factors in there. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Hi, I just want to know, are you aware of other countries going through a debate like this over a national poetry? It doesn't seem like the United States has ever had that, but even in Asia at that time.
Right, yeah. So there's a couple of factors going on here. I mean, one is that this is an observation that I think holds true for the US and for, well, at least for the English-speaking world. I can't speak authoritatively on outside of that, but newspaper poetry, which to my mind is the kind of poetry that is most likely to be engaged with political matters, is pretty common in the English-speaking world, I think at least to the beginning of the 20th century, although it's not that widely studied because the focus, as I think Chris alluded to right at the very beginning, is almost always on the serialized novel, right? I mean, we think of Charles Dickens, we think of other kind of writers. That's the primary focus when we think about the connection between print media and literature. And also, I would argue, we have to throw politics into the mix. I wouldn't be surprised if you did see satirical ditties and poetry of that kind, certainly in English-speaking media. I don't know for certain, but I wouldn't be at all surprised. Now, the area where I can answer this most authoritatively is in terms of Chinese poetry, or kanshi, in Japan. Now, I mean, at least in the Chinese perspective, it's my understanding, and if there's any sinologists here, they can perhaps correct me on this, that during the period that we were discussing, the 1890s, there were very few, if any, regularly published newspapers in China at the time. That's my understanding. Perhaps you can correct me on this if I'm... Okay. Mm-hmm.
Which was a foreign-owned by Chinese language newspaper.
Okay.
Circulated widely, so.
Okay. So not entirely accurate then, no. But yeah, okay, thank you, I stand corrected. But the thing about, I mean, Sinitic poetry, about kanshi, it actually has a very, very long history of engaging with political issues. I mean, in fact, it's almost understood that it's one of the duties of the serious kanshi poet to be speaking out on matters of concern to the nation. And I mean, I would not be at all surprised to find that you would see poetry on, you know, those precise matters in the Chinese media. You definitely did with kanshi in Japan throughout the whole of the 19th century. The poet whose work Shiki was criticizing as non-literary was a prime example of that. And in fact, there was an ongoing debate with the editor of the newspaper in which Kokubu Seigai was publishing, making very similar arguments. This guy is a talented poet. He's wasting his time writing this political junk. It's not literature. It's political diatribes set to a rhyme scheme. This is the work of some sort of, you know, rustic bumbler. He's incredibly talented poet, but he's spending all of his time writing this political stuff. And that was not because I think Kuga Katsunan, the editor of Nippon, necessarily disagreed with him. I mean, I think as far as I can tell, he was entirely in sympathy with Seigai's political views. It was really very much from an artistic point of view that basically, in much the same way as commoner and literature were incompatible, political commentary and poetry were, in some sense, also incompatible. So there's an ongoing debate here, and I wouldn't wish to give the impression that, you know, although, as I've argued, jiji-mondai, topical haikai are extremely common, I wouldn't want to convey the impression that that was uncontested. There was certainly an ongoing debate at the time as to whether that was appropriate. So yes, I mean, I would be astonished if there weren't parallel examples in certainly the English language press. I mean, you know, given the focus on you know, political issues throughout the whole of the 19th century, I would be astonished if there isn't some kind of political poetry there. Yeah. Okay.
One last question.
Okay, yeah.
Thank you for the talk. So I was curious about like how those people saw tanka during the. So you didn't mention tanka in any of the debate you cited. So I was wondering what they are talking about that.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's one that has actually a fairly clear answer. So. The thing about tanka, or I mean waka as it's initially understood in the Meiji period, that it has a much closer relationship to the Meiji government than either haiku or kanshi does. There is an official office in the Meiji government called the Outa Dokoro, which is basically charged with using using waka pretty much as a means of national subject formation, of kokumin keisei, the establishment, for instance, of the Utakai Hajime. I think this is Meiji 1873 or 4. Basically, the New Year's practice of the emperor composing a waka verse and having his citizens also respond dates from around about this time. And it actually happens that a number of the poets who are affiliated with this Outa Dokoro publish in Nippon. They're actually publishing in the same newspaper, partly because Kuga Katsunan, the editor, believes that waka is important. It's really important to encourage its growth and its importance to the nation. They're actually the Outa Dokoro poets are publishing in Nippon almost right up to the day when Masaoka Shiki publishes his very famous 1898 Utayomi ni Atoru Sho, right? These letters to a tanka poet or a waka poet, in which he really lays into the Outa Dokoro. He points out their incompetence, their sort of fundamental uselessness as poets. But there is actually a very direct parallel here, because if you look a few months before Shiki begins the serialization of this series of comments on waka, you actually see political waka as well. And it's Ochiai Naobumi and Yosa no Tekkan who are the ones who are actually doing this. There's a very similar verse to the verse about first snowfall, boots shall not pass through the gate. I won't embarrass myself by trying to recall the Japanese off the top of my head, but it's basically the imagery is they plan to plant the demon rose, right? They plan to plant the demon rose here in the shade of our sakura tree, and the headline or the title is Naichi Zakyo, mixed residence. Basically, the idea that foreigners might be allowed to reside without any restrictions in Japan. And I think it's Yosa no Tekkan writes a waka commenting on that using the image of rose, a demon rose being planted in the shade of the sakura tree. It's a very similar sort of thing. So it does happen. There are definitely examples of waka being used as a form of explicit political commentary. And that, in some ways, is even more surprising, because, I mean, that, I think, is definitely not understood as being a part of the genre. I mean, we may comment on the sort of the way in which Heian waka might seem as if they allude to certain episodes in Heian court intrigue, but to have waka being used as a direct way of criticizing the government is extremely unusual. So yes, there are some very direct parallels. I say the main difference comes from the very close association between the state government and waka, which is not necessarily there with kanji and haiku. So yes, there is a connection.
So thank you, and thank you for your questions. And please join me in thanking Rob again for his talk.
Thank you.